Warning. You've reached On the Box with Ray Comfort and are now in a biblical truth zone. Place all questions about theology, current events, and evangelism on the box, where they'll be weighed against the truth of God's Word. Ready your hearts and minds. You're about to be inspired and equipped to fulfill the Great Commission. Programming to engage in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to On the Box. We have an exciting program for you with professional bull rider Dan Wooding. No, that was last week. Yes, that's right. This week we've got my friend Dan Wooding. We've known each other for years. Dan's with Assist Ministries. He's done everything you can imagine. We've got his book here. He's met with presidents. He's met with Billy Graham, Johnny Cash, everyone. And is it true you're African American?
Yeah, I was actually born in Nigeria, and my parents were from Liverpool, England, of all places, and they went over to Nigeria in the 30s. They met and fell in love and got married, and with each other. And I was born there back in December the 19th, 1940, and my dad got very sick, and in 1942, when the war was going on, we had to come to England. He had to get treatment, and it was a horrendous journey. He had to go from Lagos to Liverpool, which was normally a 10-day journey at the most. It took 6 weeks zigzagging. The thousands of people were drowned in various situations where the German U-boats went and actually...
Yes, they were wanting to get anything on the water, weren't they?
Yeah, it was very dangerous, but we amazingly landed back in Britain, and my dad got healed and went back to Nigeria, got even sicker, had to come back, and so we settled in Britain, and now I'm a U.S. citizen. I call myself an African American. I'm probably the most unusual African American you'll ever meet.
Well, we've got a lot in common. I married an English girl. I assume my wife's English, so I know all about Jum Butties and Albert Tutlock and all the things, fish and chips and all that. Now, you're with the National Enquirer. You spent some time with tabloids as a reporter. Yeah,
I broke my dad's heart. You know, he told me never to get involved in journalism because he said journalists are wicked people. They drink, smoke, and swear. They cheat, and they persecute Christians. So I started off okay for him because I worked with Billy Graham. He had a newspaper in Britain called The Christian. I became the chief reporter with The Christian. In fact, the very first person I ever interviewed was Coretta Scott King, and it was at the memorial service for Martin Luther King, who had been shot, and I went to St. Paul's Cathedral and interviewed her. But unfortunately, the paper got shut, and I eventually went into secular journalism. And one of the first things I did, which really shocked my dad, was I helped to launch Monty Python's Flying Circus.
You did not. You're the man?
Yeah, I'm the man, unfortunately, for the man with silly walks and Minister of Silly Walks. But I used to go to the Ealing Film Studios for stories, and one day the PR lady said, "Would you like to launch Monty Python's Flying Circus? There are a bunch of crazy people starting a new show." And so I did the first story about them, and then would get invited to travel around with them, and eventually moved into the British tabloids, which, as you know, are probably the most disgraceful in the world. And I did crime, religion, and showbiz. And then one day during a drinking session in the Stab in the Back pub, one of the guys there said, "Look, I've just bought the National Enquirer. Any of you would like a job, you can have it." And
now, what was the name of the pub?
The Stab in the Back.
Who would go and drink in a pub called the Stab in the Back?
Yeah, the Stab in the Back was basically a pub for people to verbally stab each other in the back.
It sounds like a normal secular place to me.
And so I decided I didn't want to move to Florida, so I became a London correspondent for the Enquirer for a while.
So the Enquirer with their headlines, "Wife's varicose veins form map leading to hidden treasure."
Yeah, well, that was more the weekly. the Weekly World News was the worst of the two. That was owned by the Enquirer.
So who thought of that sort of stuff, those headlines? I mean, they're crazy too.
Mostly the British journalists who would say, well, Americans will believe anything, so we'll just make it up. Yeah. So that's what they did. And one day, my whole world had fallen apart, Ray. I was working for the second biggest newspaper in Europe. I was very unhappy. I'd had several death threats. I was drinking very heavily. My wife didn't really know who I was in the end. And finally, a friend of mine called Ray Barnett, who now runs the African Children's Choir, came into the bar and said, "Look at you, Dan." He said, "God's given you this gift as a writer, and all you do is write drivel for the tabloids." And I said, "Why don't you just play in the traffic?" But he wouldn't he wouldn't do that for some reason.
Play in the traffic.
And that night, I gave my life back to Christ in a drunken stupor. And then he said, "I want you to come with me to Uganda to write the story about the church under Idi Amin."
Isn't that where your dad got sick?
No, that was Nigeria.
Yeah,
but this is East Africa.
Okay.
But and so, believe it or not, and then he said something I'll never forget: "You won't get paid, and you'll probably get shot at." And I thought only a Christian could come up with a deal as good as that. But anyway, that was the turning point. That was 1980. I recommitted my life to Christ. I walked out on my career in the tabloids, went to Uganda and met some of the greatest Christians I'd ever met, and that's where I felt God's call to help persecuted believers.
Well, you've done everything that anyone could ever imagine in your life, but today is something new. You're sandwiched between a Jew and an Arab. Easy's over in the other studio. Easy, give us some questions.
Yeah, Dan, you had thought you'd done it all until today. What a delight. Let me just say it is to have you with us. Ray and I were honored to be with you on the program that you do on K-Wave. And it was just such a delight for me to hear about all the things you've done. I mean, seriously, it's hard to imagine in one lifetime that you've compressed, into your experiences, all those amazing things. And one of the things that really stood out to me, a couple of things, but one in particular, was the fact that you've been to Uganda. And I've been to Uganda twice. When I pastored, we had a mission there set up in a refugee camp ministering to Sudanese refugees. And so, of course, when I was there, I heard so many stories about Idi Amin, and I ended up watching the movie Last King of Scotland, when Forrest Whitaker played Idi Amin. But what was that like? I mean, to have interviewed a dictator who's responsible for the murder of, I think, 300,000 Christians?
Yeah, 300,000.
Tell us about that, Dan.
Well, what happened was that he'd actually just left the country. I think he knew I was coming, and he'd gone to live with a wonderful man called the head of Libya, Gaddafi.
Yeah, Gaddafi.
Yeah. Right.
And he pulled the gun on Gaddafi, and Gaddafi wasn't very pleased with that and told him in no uncertain manner to get out. So when I arrived with Ray, now remember I was a Hollywood-type reporter interviewing a lot of celebrities, and suddenly I'm in this country. Entebbe Airport was just blown up. It was a real mess. We get downtown, there's no running water, no electricity, and the very first night I could hear gunfire, people screaming, and I said to Ray, "What have you got me into here?" And he said, "Well, where would you rather be, in the center of God's will, or back in Fleet Street where you've hated every moment of it?" And
Wow.
so I met some of these amazing people. The first day I was in Uganda, we went to a church that had been shot up. There were hundreds of bullet holes throughout the church building, and they told me that Idi Amin had banned a lot of the churches there, and this one was particularly banned. So they decided to change their name. He would get on the Voice of Uganda. I'm not very good at Idi Amin's voice, but he'd say, "Okay," and then he'd say, "The Baptists are closed, and you've Salvation Army, and the First Full Gospel Church of Makere, you're shut." That's not very good, is it, of Idi Amin? But anyway, and so what happened was they changed their name to the Second Full Gospel Church of Makere, and they started meeting. Well, Amin didn't particularly like that, so he sent his troops in. They shut up the church. They arrested 200 members of the church. They put them in a parking lot. They then drove them off to Nakasero, the torture center for Idi Amin, and they surrounded them with gasoline cans and said, "We're going to burn you alive."
Wow.
And when I heard this, I thought, how would I respond to that? And they basically said, we began to praise God because we thought it was a privilege to die for Jesus.
Wow.
And they said the very first martyrs in Uganda were kids who were burnt at the stake for refusing to deny their Lord. And what happened was they were just waiting for the execution order to be signed by a man called Mustafa Idrisi. He was in his Mercedes with a convoy coming back to Kampala to sign the death order so they'd be burnt alive, and his car crashed into another car. He broke both his arms, both his legs. It couldn't have happened to a nicer guy, and they couldn't sign. He couldn't sign because he couldn't do anything. So they were put in prison, and this was their first Sunday out of prison. And that Sunday, they all came. I took them outside. I photographed them. I did a story called The Church That Was Sentenced to Be Burnt Alive. And then one by one, they did something, guys, I've never, ever got over. One by one, they began to thank God for they went to the front one at a time and thank God for their freedom. And then every one of them prayed that Idi Amin would be saved. Wow. They never prayed that he would die a terrible death. They prayed that he would be saved. And that really affected me. This wasn't the sort of Christianity that I was used to. I was used to people just criticizing each other, picking fights with the pastor over the color of the carpet. And suddenly these people are thanking God for their freedom and praying that he would help save Idi Amin, who eventually went to live in Saudi, by the way, and died there. An Islamic hero. He only killed 300,000 Christians.
Wow.
Wow.
So that was the turning point, and that's when I said, Lord, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
That's amazing.
Busy life. So tell me about this book, From Truth...
From tabloid to truth.
Truth to tabloid.
Well, many years ago, after I'd finished in Uganda, a man called Brother Andrew, who wrote the book God's Smuggler, heard about me and asked me if I would do some writing with him, and eventually worked with him for a total of 7 years, traveled around with him.
So for those new generation that don't know what we know about Brother Andrew, can you give us a little synopsis of
Yeah,
what
he's a Dutchman who decided that there were still believers. Here he is. Yeah, they've said they were still believers in the former Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union, and began smuggling Bibles in his Volkswagen into these countries. And then he decided to switch to the Islamic world and started ministering to Christians living in Pakistan, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in various places of the world. And on one occasion, he took me into Hebron during a gun battle, and the IDF, the forces were fighting with the Palestinians, and he said, now I want you to interview me. I said, come on, this is crazy. Bombs are going off, people are screaming. And I said to him, okay, Brother Andrew, set up the camera. Let's get this over quickly before we get killed. And I said, Brother Andrew, why should we love Muslims? And he turned to me down and he said, because Islam should mean I sincerely love all Muslims. Yeah. And I thought that was pretty amazing. And then he said, now, if you think this is dangerous, I'm taking you into Gaza tomorrow, and you're going to meet one of the heads of Hamas. And I get into Gaza, and I interview this man, one who I see almost daily on CNN. And I asked Andrew, why would you want me to meet this man? And he said, well, believe it or not, this man and the Hamas leadership love me so much that they let me come into the Islamic University every 3 months or so and teach a course on biblical Christianity. Wow. And I said, well, that's pretty amazing. He said the very first time they announced me, he said the kids en masse in the conference center there got up and tried to leave, and the Hamas gunman blocked the door. And he said, I've never before had a terrorist group stop kids leaving for me to be able to preach the gospel. Wow. That sounds like one of your stories, Ray. You know? Wow. But that was a pretty wonderful experience. And then he asked me to move to America. This was back in 1982, and for several years I worked with him doing his media work, and then eventually started my own ministry. But he agreed to write the foreword eventually. We can just about see by Brother Andrew there. And we called it From Tabloid to Truth. And it was really the story of going from being born in Nigeria to all the experiences in those tabloid days, to working with the persecuted church. And, you know, I just thought many people still look at the tabloids with a big laugh, but they're very dangerous. You know, they're basically producing junk, and they're feeding junk into the minds of our people. And so, you know, I want the people to know there's something more important than reading the tabloids as you're leaving the checkout there at your supermarket.
Dan, tell us about Assist Ministries and how people can get involved and what you do.
Well, when we started, we were trying to think of a name, and a friend of mine from Eastbourne in Britain came up with the name Assist, and he said, call it Aid to Special Saints in Strategic Times. And we thought, well, that's wonderful. We want to help these persecuted believers, whatever their country they're from. And we also, they are special saints. And so we came up with that name. But for quite a while, I didn't do my journalism anymore. I went through a period of feeling guilt. I thought, how can God use an ex-tabloid journalist to... how can he use it? So I did ministry. I smuggled Bibles to Cuba and visited various countries. And then one day in the early 90s, both of you, I get a phone call from Billy Graham's press officer, Larry Ross. And he said, Dan, he said, Mr. Graham's going to have a historic crusade in Moscow. We would like you to come along and write a lot of the stories about it. He said, we need someone to tabloidize the media because it's a bit boring at the moment. And I said, well, I'm not doing journalism anymore, Larry. And he said, come on. He said, that's the only thing you're any good at, which I thought was a bit rude. But anyway, so believe it or not, I flew to Moscow. I spent 3 weeks every day with Mr. Graham. It was a wonderful experience. And it just got me back into journalism. He hired me to go with him to Puerto Rico, to Germany. I wrote the cover story for Saturday Evening Post about Billy and Franklin. And that got me back into journalism. So I then decided I wanted to start a news service about the persecuted church called the Assist News Service. And this is a news service that is free. Anybody watching, just go to www.assistnews.net and we'll send you the stuff free. But if you would like to be inspired about what is happening to the church around the world, this is a news service for you. So there it is. It's on the screen there. And then I got back into writing
just
books.
A little thing that'll help you in life. You don't need to say www anymore.
Oh, yeah, people know straight away.
Just go straight to assistnews.net. It saves life's experience.
Yeah. So that was the turning point. And we have writers from all over the world. And then I'm constantly traveling. Last year I went to Indonesia with your friend Ray Barnett and Emil Haddad, who both of you know from Ambassadors for Peace, and had the privilege of interviewing a whole bunch of Muslim leaders, which I'd never done before. And it was very, very interesting to get their perspective. And then both Ray and Emil were able to share the gospel with them, particularly at the Islamic University in Jakarta. And so every year I go to some of these weird and wonderful places and I'm able to write about it. And I must say that it's one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done is to tell the world about these heroes of the faith that are living under the most terrible conditions around the world.
Wow, Dan. I thought one Ray and Emil team were enough for the world. There's another one out there?
Yeah.
Dan, let me just say, your passion for the persecuted church is so refreshing. Like I said, I used to minister through the church I pastored in Uganda to persecuted Christians. But we've also, through Living Waters, have had the privilege of working with Open Doors. Open Doors USA in particular. Our friend Carl Moeller over there and Jane Huckabee, we've done some projects together. And what a blessing that is. In fact, Open Doors recognize you with an award for passion for the persecuted church. So we have a video on that, and we want to go ahead and roll that.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege knowing Dan Wooding for all these years and Assist Ministry. Assist has been just a tremendous organization that's really reached out with a passion and a heart for the persecuted church. And in recognition of this, I'd like to present this plaque to Mr. Wooding, and for his years of really reaching out and his team of reporters. They did a tremendous job, and they're getting the word out about the persecuted church, I believe, to about 3,000 media sites. And he's traveled all over the world, and he has many stories to tell. But this plaque, let me just read what it says from Open Doors, Passion for the Persecuted Award, presented to Assist News Service for the commitment to informing the public of the plight of persecuted Christians around the world, February 2012. And Dan, it's a privilege presenting this to you. We've known each other for many years, and I just really, really appreciate what you've done for thousands of believers.
Wow, what a blessing that is. And Dan, eternity is going to show the impact that you've had through your devotion to the persecuted believers in the persecuted church, and how much that blessed so many. So praise the Lord for that. Now I have a question, and this sort of impacts me in a way, just because I was born in Lebanon, and that's my native home, and have a desire to see it reached. But you actually were in Lebanon in 1984. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was just after I'd moved to the U.S., and a friend of mine called Ray Barnett, the very man who took me to Uganda, was running Lebanon Aid, which was part of George Otis's operation there, connected with the Voice of Hope radio station.
George Otis is the Otis elevator lift?
No, not that one. No. He used to work for Learjet. But he started High Adventure Ministries and had this amazing radio station that eventually got blown up in Lebanon.
Wow.
It was just in the south, just over the good fence there in Israel. And I never forget, every day we would go across from Metula into southern Lebanon, and we'd come to these roadblocks with these guys with masks on and automatic weapons, and I was just expecting to die at any moment. You know how dangerous it was, Emil, in those days. And so what happened was we went all over Lebanon, and then he said, I'm taking you up to the Shuf Mountains. These are the people that actually killed all the American Marines down in Beirut. And we're going to go up there and we're going to witness to them. And that was not the safest thing to do, but we went to Lebanon. I love Lebanon. I found the people beautiful. I found some of the food a bit strange, though.
Watch it, Dan.
We had sheep's brain one day. You know.
Oh, that makes you think, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, I have that for breakfast every day.
Maybe go out and stand on the lawn for a while.
Sheep brain cereal is the best.
So, did you try tabbouleh?
Did I try one?
Tabbouleh, you know what that is?
Yes, oh yeah. I like all the years. There's this big joke about in Britain where you go to a butcher's shop and you'd ask for a sheep's brain or a sheep's head, and then you'd say, but it has to be an Irish head. And they say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, you say, well, take the brains out.
Oh, boy.
We apologize to our Irish viewers.
So if you're watching in Ireland, we're sorry about that.
You know, Dan, it's amazing when I think of the spectrum that you've covered. I mean, we talked about one of the most infamous dictators of all time, Idi Amin. You go from that all the way to some of the most famous people in pop culture, which would have been the Beatles. And you actually interviewed a couple of the Beatles. Did I have that right?
Yeah, I interviewed. Well, it was the most bizarre situation. At Wembley Stadium in London, the big soccer stadium, there was going to be a big rock concert with the Eagles, the Beach Boys, and Elton John. And by the way, Elton John's written the foreword for my latest book, but I'm digress. Sorry about that. I'm a bit like Ray. I never miss a moment. And when we got in, I managed to talk my way into the royal box, and there was Paul with his wife and kids, and there was Ringo with his wife and kids. And I went up to Paul, and I said, Paul, are you enjoying the show? And he said, who'd you work for? Because, you know, he smelled a tabloid journalist.
Right.
And so I said, I work for the Sunday People. And he suddenly said, quiet, everybody. He's from the Sunday People. And he broke into this, he made up this song, billions of dollars worth of rock talent joined in harmony.
Wow.
And I go purple with embarrassment. Anyway, finally he leaves. And I then try with Ringo. And Ringo says, quiet, everybody, and he sings it. So I did a story recently, and I said, Paul, I've heard your latest album, and I can't hear that song on the album. When are you going to put it on? So it's really bizarre that Paul McCartney sort of invented a song for me.
Yeah,
Wow.
oh, that's great.
That is fascinating.
So you've been to North Korea also, and you were held up by gunmen, 5 teenage gunmen in Bethlehem.
Yeah, that was with my poor wife. First time she'd ever been to the Middle East. We decided to go into Bethlehem. We'd gone the day before into Gaza, had no trouble in Gaza, of all things. And then when we got into Bethlehem, our taxi driver suddenly stopped in horror, and he saw gunmen everywhere. Wow. 5 teenagers suddenly pulled our car in, thought we were Jewish settlers, thought we were going to actually get involved in a gun battle.
You really look Jewish.
Yeah. and they pointed them at our head. My poor wife and myself are sitting in the car wondering what is going to happen to us. And amazingly, we were just surreal. We just sat there watching these 5 kids, younger than my kids, pointing guns at us.
Amazing.
And finally, the taxi driver just persuaded them that we were just visitors, and they let us go. And so we went to the Bethlehem Bible College, where I have a dear friend. We got out of the car. They began throwing rocks at us. And my wife said, boy, this is a friendly place where Jesus was born.
Another rock concert.
But anyway, when we get there, there's Brother Andrew, of all people, staying in the Bethlehem Bible College, and he had a room called the Smuggler's Inn. So
really?
we were able to tell him, be a little bit careful in Bethlehem at the moment. It's getting a bit dangerous.
Wow. Dan, we've got about a minute, but can you really quickly, I'm really curious to hear about this strange experience you had in North Korea. Can you tell us that real quick?
Yeah, I got invited. I've been to just about every country except North Korea. And out of the blue, I get a phone call from a friend saying, I think I can get you into North Korea. Get on the first plane to Beijing and meet with a gentleman there called David Cho. He's not the younger Cho, but another David Cho. And David Cho took me to the North Korean embassy with a few other people, and I was one of 3 people. Got a visa to get into North Korea, spent the most bizarre 1 week broadcasting live for the UPI radio network in North Korea. I probably was the only Christian that had ever been in as a journalist. Wow. And it was absolutely fascinating to see this bizarre regime that at the moment is just a real tragedy. The world's worst persecutor of Christians is North Korea.
Wow. Wow. Well, you hardly ever hear of that on secular news, do you?
No, you don't hear a lot, but it's a very sad situation there.
Well, thanks for joining us. Remember to pray for the persecuted church, our brethren that are suffering for the faith, and also to uphold Dan and his family, and for Assist Ministries. Thanks for joining us.
AssistNews.net. Remember that.
AssistNews.net.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For questions about On the Box with Ray Comfort, or to submit questions for future shows, please email onthebox@livingwaters.com. That's onthebox@livingwaters.com. On the Box with Ray Comfort is an outreach of Living Waters. For more resources to inspire and equip you to fulfill the Great Commission, check out livingwaters.com or call toll-free 1-800-437-1893. Now go and preach the gospel.